Welcome back, everybody, to me not talking about Malazan, which will happen again on Monday when we go into Dance's Lament. Today, we're still talking about Salman Rushdie because I figured, like yesterday's video is doing so badly, I I can try to actually get below that. So let's see how that goes. Point is, we're talking about the third essay in Languages of Truth, and that one's called Heraclitus, about that philosopher. So it's going to be a quick one. Maybe I'll actually have time later on to do a second video. We'll see where that goes. Otherwise, there's tomorrow, I guess. So yeah, let's do that. Cheers. So yeah, Heraclitus is another one of a slightly long-ish essays in Languages of Truth. There's going to be a couple more, and there's a lot of like short stuff, so I'm not sure how many of those I'll go through. I mean, if you really don't want to see them, that's also fine. If you want me to continue, I'll see what I can get. Just, let me know in the comments if you want to hear more about that book, or if you're just like, well, now that he's no longer trashing fantasy, we could probably just do something else. We'll see. Anyway, Heraclitus deals with something, and that's a general, like, I don't want to call it a dichotomy, but it deals with the question of whether character informs fate or fate informs character, to put it mildly. We start with that idea of, that Heraclitus quote that says ethos is daimon, which means exactly, well, if you depending on how you translate it, basically means that a specific character, like how your character determines your fate in a lot of ways. And well, I guess you could probably call character personality in this regard, although it is more than that. And but we're not here to discuss like Greek translations but we're talking about stuff that will come out of it later on, right? And the example that Rushdie gives, like at the beginning, is an interesting one. It is an example of the Peanuts, which makes a lot of sense. Go read the Peanuts; they're great. And the fact that when Charles Schulz decided to stop drawing Peanuts comics, a lot of readers begged him to at least once let Charlie Brown actually kick the football, and he didn't do that. And Rushdie says, yeah, well, it is inherent in Charlie Brown's character that he cannot do that, because he would no longer be Charlie Brown if he actually kicked the football. And on the other hand, it would also, Lucy would no longer be Lucy if she would let Charlie Brown actually kick the football. So there's that idea that like character informs up to a specific point your like personal character or personality, and this then obviously goes into writing a lot. It's like determines what kind of things can happen to you and how those things happen to you in a way. So if you're the kind of person that, or the kind of character that Charlie Brown is, then yes, you will always be very, very trusting, and that trust will always be taken advantage of in a way. Now, apart from the fact that I personally don't believe that if you are a trusting person, your trust will ultimately always get taken advantage of, but that's like another part. The argument that Rushdie then takes from there on is that in today's world, at least, this is no longer a stable way to write characters or to think of characters as having an archetypal or whatever stable character that does not change over time, and that that does not change over time and will ultimately determine your fate, because the world does a lot of stuff that your character has no impact on. So ultimately, he says that he's in favor of also being aware of the fact that characters change from day to day. They can change. The world is a random, surreal place where constancy, that's kind of harkening back to what we spoke about yesterday in Proteus. that constancy being an element of realist fiction that he's kind of trying to, well, I don't know, say not bash, but denigrate a bit. Realist, that constancy is part of that, and his argument is then once again that the world isn't like that and characters aren't like that. We're going to look at that character thing first a bit, and then we're going to, probably ramble off into the into the white green yonder or wherever. So, what's his argument? His argument is that in at least today's world, probably also earlier on, but at least in today's world, being the great big mess that it is, oftentimes it's circumstances that inform our characters. He picks a lot of real world examples where it's like child soldiers being one of them. It's like there's war and famine and it forces children to become soldiers, but that's not exactly, their like innermost character, their ethos before the circumstances make them into that. Or like more drastic, radical things, right? It's like once again, it's like natural catastrophe, like natural disasters, or for him, I don't know exactly when that essay or speech was first written, but he obviously goes back to 9/11. It's like the ethos, the character of all those people dying in those in the crashes there had nothing to do with what happened to them. It's not informing their like fate. That was something entirely different. Now, obviously, he's right about that. Your character has an impact on what happens to you, but only in part. And then there's the huge uncaring universe and random events that just fuck you over. We all know that. The argument, the problem that we then face, obviously, there's like two problems there. The first one is the problem that the novelist faces, that being trying to either make no sense of randomness and just like portray it as randomness, or to try and find some kind of fate behind it, some guiding hand, some guiding principle, what have you. There's an interesting aside here that I find like super ridiculous and shows the snobbishness of Salman Rushdie again. That is, he goes on about literature and then he's like, well, Hollywood movies cannot live without random events and like random chance. And the two the two examples he gives are Peter Parker being bitten by a spider, becomes Spider-Man, and Bilbo Baggins finding the ring, which is so fucked up and stupid because those are both not originally movies. The randomness there is not Hollywood's. The randomness there is their authors, J.R. Tolkien and whoever wrote Spider-Man, invented Spider-Man, which I have no idea about. But so I don't know why he calls that Hollywood, which kind of fucked me up a bit, but I don't want to get too deeply into it. Come on, man. You know that J.R. Tolkien is an author. You actually mention it like a sentence afterwards, but you call it Hollywood? I don't know. I don't get it. Probably it's, even though he mentioned it in Wonder Tales as a good example, probably it's still not proper literature, but only fantasy, so maybe Tolkien got his hopes up too early. Okay, let's not harp too much on that problem. I just found it ridiculous that while he certainly has a point that in movies there's a lot of randomness, random events happening and random chance happening, a lot of movies are built on that. You have your, and he goes through those later on, right? Your classic romantic comedy where two people by sheer chance run into each other and find true love and whatnot. Those things exist, obviously, and are probably more prevalent in generally on the medium of film because you have less room. You have less room to actually explain things and whatnot. So dropping in just a random event, a car crash or what have you, to start things makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it also happens in real life. You have an accident, you suddenly meet people, and a lifetime long war against that other person or something else comes out of it. Like random events dictate how we live our lives. That's true, but I just find it ridiculous that he says Hollywood and then he picks picks Spider-Man and the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I don't know. Come on, you can do better. That's just lazy. But we need to go back to the main two problems. The first problem being randomness, or randomness informing characters and so forth in literature, where there's a certain school of thought or like criticism that has been around forever, and it's I don't want to pin it down to like literary critics or like random people on the internet, because you can find it in both. But there's a certain school of thought that goes like, yeah, if something just happens randomly, the author was probably too lazy to come up with a good motive. And I would say there's certainly cases to be made for chance as lazy storytelling. They certainly exist. For example, in The Sword of Truth, I keep forgetting his name, it doesn't even matter. When the main guy, probably Will, I have no idea, that dude just like runs across a dragon that just like happens to be sitting on the road, and you know there's no reason for that to happen exactly in that way, except that he needs a dragon because he needs to get him from A to B. That's randomness that is lazy storytelling, for example. On the other hand, there are situations where randomness is just the way it works, especially when you go into, say, the military fantasy. Malazan has situations where there's just like random chance and people just randomly die because that's how it happens. Say in Carcanas, one of the characters near the end in Fall of Light dies because his horse, gets scared and he falls off his horse and breaks his neck. Is that like a satisfying end? Is that a satisfying end for us, the reader? Of course not. It's like, why did that happen? There's no reason for that. Which is interesting because a couple of pages before that we have a similar situation where a horse slips on ice, and thus, events are changed because that horse slipped on ice. But it's slightly implicated that there was magic in place actually creating the ice. And then, like in a different situation, well, just someone dies because that's just how it happens. People fall off ships and drown or not. This shit just happens. It's just it falls, I guess, to the author to make sure that you don't find it that it doesn't resemble a plot convenience, or if it resembles a plot convenience because you don't know how to actually get around that situation except by a random event, then at least not let it happen too often, because sometimes people get lucky. Sometimes the person who is poor and has like debts with with organized crime may actually win the lottery. It may that's chance for you. And chance, obviously, as something that when we as people who think narratively and think of our lives in narratives, obviously find random chance dissatisfying when we read it in a book where we expect the narrative to make more sense, which once again it doesn't have to. So on the one hand we have that, and Salman Rushdie, not actually going too deeply into like how like random chance actually changes plots, goes more into like, the world is random, incorporate some more of that randomness because it makes it like your fiction more wild, and goes against that, like you can basically plot out the end of a story, kind of realist fiction or what have you. You can actually plot that out from the beginning because people don't change and so forth. And he has a point there. He certainly has a point there, because there are like forms of fiction where the point of the characters is not to be realistic characters, or the point of the entire story is to rob you of all hope because dumb people do dumb things, don't learn, and then there's a horrible end at the end. Which, there's certainly room for that kind of fiction. I'm just not a huge fan of it. So I'm with Rushdie on the idea that like having a bit more wildness in your fans in your fiction is a cool thing, which is good. So now let's look up on the other side of that, that being like elements from the real world that he puts in there. So one argument that he has is that events like outside real world events taking over the paths of characters is something that has become more prevalent in our modern age, and I'm not quite sure if I agree with him. Certainly, there's situations where that is the case. He makes the example of Jane Austen's novels where soldiers show up, but like war never plays a role because the impacts of war on soldiers are not what Jane Austen talks about. Whereas if you have like soldiers show up in a modern novel, stuff like trauma and all the political baggage that comes with war, can no longer really be ignored. You can no longer just look good in uniform, unless obviously it's some kind of very, very simplistic erotica fiction about like a uniform fetish. Then of course that's still possible. Not that Jane Austen wrote anything like that. I'm just saying. So the point there stands that like in our day and age, with a say more global awareness, it is much more the importance of the world on people has become much more of a thing. It's also, with sociological and psychological studies and the actual development of those academics disciplines, we have come to realize that the outside world, society, form our character far more than the other way around. We're not born to be good or evil or geniuses or what have you. We're born and then we're formed by being pounded by the universe for years and years and years, and that pounding never lets off, so we continue to evolve over time. That's just like how we, with the change and growth of academia, of the sciences, have started to perceive our universe. And obviously there's people that will love to put everything down to genes, and to those people I usually say fuck you, because fuck you. But there's certainly an argument to be had about which parts of a human's potential are set in stone, so to speak, and which parts are a result of growing up in a specific society and all these outside influences. Now the question there, however, I feel the important question there is like, what do we do with that as living beings, and how does that then once again reflect on the kind of fiction we read, or what fiction can do? And here we come back to the fact that random chance having too much of an impact on characters in fiction feels dissatisfying. And I think that's good that it feels dissatisfying, because I feel, this is me feeling and thinking, not, making good arguments, but we're talking about fiction, so who am I kidding? The point there is, and I feel this, as I said, is important. Is at the heart of a lot of like human nature is that we want to be in control. We wish to be in control of as much of our destiny as possible, as much of our fate as possible. We believe, or we want to believe, in our capability to change, to adapt, to grow, to become better people, to recognize mistakes, change, and yes, improve. It's at the heart of modern days like ethos in a lot of ways. You look at like advertisements and whatnot, what our glorious consumer capitalism is trying to sell us, a system is trying to sell us. It's like you can buy, well, obviously in those cases spending money, but in general there is always a potential to be a better person, a different person, for all kinds of versions of better and so forth. Some of those are just like become rich, which is fucked up, but some of them are also about personal choices, capabilities, physical and mental capabilities, and whatnot. So there's that. Otherwise, we wouldn't go into gyms and train our asses off and stuff like that. So that is at the heart of our ethos. So reading that, reading books or watching narratives where sheer happenstance controls characters no matter what they do, goes directly against what we are taught to believe. Um, yeah, what we are taught to believe by the entirety of our, like, at least Western society, which may lead once again to the fact that people like, or a lot of people enjoy reading books or watching movies where characters, due to their personality, have a lot of agenda and are not just crushed by the universe. Although that's the other part there, agenda and character. You know, we want those people to have an agenda and a kind of stable character, but we still believe in their ability to actually improve their character as well. Which strikes us, is that whole idea of like a balance between those things, because once again, sheer randomness is not a lot of fun, um, unless you go for your whole like exquisite corpse drawings and whatnot. You can play with that kind of stuff in art, obviously, but it's not exactly satisfying beyond an immediate shock. And yeah, I feel what we can learn from that in the end is that yes, we have a lot of control over our circumstances, and to also accept that, and this is important, that things that are holding us back or that are getting in the way of our personal, us personally expressing our characters, growing, changing, becoming the kind of person that we want to be. What is holding us back is not innate, apart from like very few situations, like I can't grow wings and fly. That's just like, But apart from that, what is holding us back is usually the outside world. It's society, it's sometimes other people, it's sometimes just like the physical facts of a planet that we as a species have fucked up so bad that like the weather is changing, forests are burning, and people are getting flooded and whatnot. That's the outside world. But we can always keep on fighting that, and it's important to know and to accept that we don't have to accept society holding us back, holding us down. We can always just fight against that and try to be the best kind of person that we want to be. So in the end, I would say while the world obviously has an impact on our characters and how we form our characters, we are still the arbiters of that up to a point. Obviously, death by plane crash is death by plane crash, and there's nothing we can do about that. But apart from those radical physical versions of it, most of the time we have choices, and we need to express those. We need to make those choices to take control and make our characters, make our personalities, our fate and destiny. So yeah, that's something that goes beyond what Rushdie is saying, because Rushdie obviously only wants to explain why him not writing serious literary fiction, realist literary fiction, is not a problem, and his brand of slightly magical, slightly fantastical fiction is the best. So he doesn't go too far into that. Although one thing that I think is important at the end of it, before we close here for today, is his look at how fiction has become more magical, more fluid in a lot of ways, due to the fact that through globalism and migration, a lot of people have already been uprooted and have experienced that change of the world that has forced them to change as people, have experienced that firsthand, and are now more how to say, willing to actually express that in the books they write, because once you have moved to a different country and realized all the things, you realize that you have changed and grown, or not grown, but you realize the change, the mutability of lives and characters. You come to realize that you don't have to end the same way you started. And that, I feel, is an encouraging and interesting look at what migration does to our global consciousness. Because if those, as he calls them, uprooted writers and other artists create art where all of these things are an essential part, then even those of us who have not been uprooted, who consume that art, will, through that process of figuring out the human condition through, consuming art, change our minds and realize a lot of things about the mutability of the world and our characters, and that's a good thing. So yeah, pretty cool. I'll talk to you about something else tomorrow or later, and until then, cheers.